I'm Aaron Fawn, and I'm on a trip for life.
Cosmos is full beyond measure. Elegant truths of exquisite interrelationships of the awesome machinery of nature. I believe our future depends powerfully on how well we understand this cosmos, in which we float like a mote of dust in the morning sky.
Let's begin with a quick recap of Part 1. Meditation is an ancient practice that is highly diverse in both the cultures that practice it and the ways it can be practiced. Meditation can be painfully slow to produce changes in mental states, so for as long as people have been meditating, they have also been coming up with ways, both environmental and pharmaceutical, to speed it up. Acoustic genius Robert Monroe stumbled across an excellent way to enhance meditation using audio, and founded the Monroe Institute to explore its use. They are continuing to develop the technology and conduct meditation retreats to help people expand their consciousness. But all of this begs a question.
Now, at this point, some of you may be asking, Aaron, why are you even covering this? This seems really off topic. Well, let's step back for a moment. A lot of the technologies and techniques that I have covered and I plan on covering have been fully formed and ready for quite some time. And yet, even though implementing these technologies would be highly beneficial for our society and our culture, and probably very profitable as well, it hasn't happened. Why is that? Well, it's very easy to get stuck in a rut. Just keep doing things the old way. Because it requires investment to do things in a new way, and because, frankly, you have to be able to conceptualize the ability to do things differently before you'll do things differently. It turns out that people who meditate, and people who take the time to understand themselves, are much better at embracing new technologies and embracing new ways of being. This is because, well, their consciousness has already been raised, and their minds have already been blown, so new things don't seem that new to them anymore. Just as places like growing power can grow the food that we need to nourish our bodies, meditation, and places that facilitate meditation like the Monroe Institute can help to grow our wisdom so that we can embrace new technologies like growing power. And maybe if we can meditate on a better future, we'll end up building lots of growing powers because we'll realize that that's the way to go forward.
Bearing all that in mind, let's return to Paul Rademacher, Executive Director of the Monroe Institute.
So, I suppose if you could summarize what the mission of the Monroe Institute is in a very short sentence or so, what would you say that is?
Well, our vision statement says we're about the awakening of humanity. So we see ourselves as playing a role in a very key transition as far as the human race is concerned. And that transition is an evolution in consciousness that I think that is really the next frontier and the hope for the future. And so within that, our part is both as a research and educational institute, and because we're a nonprofit, our whole emphasis is on service to the world.
The last few years have seen an explosion in the interest in brain entrainment techniques. Popular magazines like Make Magazine are even showing people how to build light and sound entrainment systems for themselves.
Right.
Given that the Monroe Institute was way ahead of the curve in the use of sound to manipulate mental states, how do you guys feel about this new burst of interest?
I think it's great. As I mentioned before, we're a nonprofit organization, and we're really interested that human consciousness advances, that we move into this next evolutionary step. So we really don't consider anybody to be a competitor in what we're doing, because we're really interested in serving humanity. So however people are helping to make that evolutionary step is fine with us. Obviously, we'd love to have people come to the Institute because that's how we stay in business and are able to offer our service. But we applaud the whole movement in that direction and think it's a very healthy thing.
Now, at the same time, certain groups are working to capitalize upon this interest by selling audio entrainment as a drug-like experience.
Right.
Now, I would argue this is ridiculous because a drug is very much like a cudgel. It's going in and changing the chemistry of your brain.
Right.
If somebody injects you with heroin, you can't just ignore that.
Right.
You're going to experience that whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
iDozer comes to mind when it comes to these sort of claims. What is your opinion on the matter, and do you think that they should sort of restrain themselves a little bit when they make claims like this?
Even if I thought so, they wouldn't listen to me. So, I mean, I think it's kind of humorous, because it's so much our culture to hype things. I mean, particularly if you happen to be in a for-profit endeavor. And so, iDozer was really pretty clever in that they intentionally tried to create the impression that these were very similar to drug-light states, and they knew that they were going to create a firestorm when they did that. And the old adage is really true. There's no such thing as bad publicity. So it was very interesting to me to watch the mainstream media pick up on this, and I was interviewed by several newspapers and several radio programs about this very issue. And of course, then that phenomenon was augmented by videos on YouTube, where you saw these young people who were writhing in pain and just out of their minds with craziness. And as I watched those videos, I thought, well, that doesn't look very much different from any teenager that's listening to music and playing the air guitar, So, but still, they hyped it up as if this was something that was truly dangerous. And I think, for me, the issue comes down to this. We have created this hysteria around the idea of altered states of awareness, and the idea that in connecting that with drug-induced altered states of awareness, ignoring the fact, as I said before, that we move through altered states of awareness every day of our lives, the most dramatic and magical of them being the awareness and movement into sleep. I mean, that's absolutely astonishing that we have that capacity. That's a huge shift in awareness. So for me, when you're talking about these matters, from a cultural standpoint, it's not really a question of, are we going to allow our teenagers to go into altered states of awareness? It's really a question of, how broad are we going to allow ourselves and our teenagers? How broad is that spectrum of awareness? The more we become comfortable with that and the more we integrate that as a part of our normal everyday life, the less mysterious it becomes and the more useful it becomes. And in fact, we've got this hysteria up to a fever pitch, that so much so that we're really cutting off a huge portion of what it means to be human. Yeah. And our society, I think, has suffered as a result of that.
Yeah, there's another term for this hysteria, and it's sort of a moral panic. That people are panicking because they feel like that their base morals are being violated. And for some people, it is indeed the question: should I allow my kids to experience altered states of consciousness? In which case, I'd say you should keep them up all night long.
They're going to be up all night long anyway.
Well, yeah, exactly.
The other thing that's really interesting about the teenage years is, unbeknownst to many people, this is a time when the brain is really growing from a neuron perspective.
It's changing dramatically.
Dramatically. And those neurons are looking for new experiences. And I don't care what you do. Teenagers, that's just part of what it is to be a teenager, is to want to explore. And so I think it would be really healthy if parents would kind of relax a little bit and just include this as part of their normal conversation with their teenagers.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways to alter your consciousness. You can stand in a place and spin around in circles until you want to bark. But if you
sound like you've had experiences.
not intentionally. It's been on amusement rides mostly. Right. And we put our kids on amusement rides all the time, and we think that's great, and that really does alter their consciousness because they're being very excited. They're being spun around in circles. We need to sort of understand that there are many different ways of manipulating consciousness. Everything from just going to sleep to going on an amusement ride or just laying beside a burbling brook and just kind of understand this as part of normal life. It's not possible for people to use open source products like Gneural to create their own brain entrainment. Mm-hmm. Now, as you said, you don't see this as a competitor, and that's very good. But I noticed upon touring your labs that you have a very sophisticated software package for the generation of brain entrainment tracks that you've developed in-house. Mm-hmm. Have you ever considered, polishing it up a little bit and marketing this software as a product to all the DIY brain hackers out there so that they can sort of make up their own cool tracks and put them on the entrainment device that they've been building?
We haven't done that yet. We're entering in a very creative phase at the Institute right now, both from a research and programmatic perspective. And so we're entertaining a lot of ideas that we've never entertained before. So, we're looking at, what would it mean to approach things from a more open source perspective, to bring in more fresh ideas and new creativity. So that's one aspect of the question. But for me, there's also another aspect, which is when you're looking at some of these brainwave generators, in some ways it's like taking a sledgehammer to the issue, because it's much more subtle than that. There's a lot of nuance that goes into creating these the context for these experiences. One of them being that if you don't alter what you're offering the brain, in other words, changing up the signals, the brain can get habituated and bored with that and simply move out of it. So there's a lot of artistry that's involved along with the technology to create things that are truly effective.
Indeed, a lot of the products do just create a single tone.
Right.
I brought up G-neural specifically because it's designed so that you can modulate
Right.
the beat over a very long period of time. So you can create a very complex experience.
Right.
And then you can either take that and put it into GarageBand and overlay things. I like to take rain tracks or burbling brooks and put them underneath it, over top of it. Or you can do it within the application itself. And I think that's why G-neural is probably the best one out there right now. If anybody is interested in experimenting, that's probably the one that I would go for.
But you bring up another issue, the part of the nuance in that, which is not just the binaural beat itself, but also the setting for that binaural beat, because the binaural beat's effectiveness can be altered by whatever other aspects you're introducing, from a musical perspective. And then also, you've got in guided meditations, you've got the pacing of the voice itself, and the imagery that's being induced. So there's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, there certainly are, and there's a lot of room for experimentation. I find that you can have the exact same binaural beat but on a different frequency, and one might be incredibly grating, and the other one might not work at all.
Right.
And so it takes experimentation to figure out what works. And so the trial and error methods that the Monroe Institute has pioneered are actually very useful in figuring out, what is working for you and what is working in a general sense.
And that was something that Bob Monroe did extensively. I really do think that he was tied into some pretty unique information in what he was doing, but he was also a tinkerer and an engineer, and so he was always testing everything he did for its effectiveness from a laboratory perspective. You couldn't go to Bob Monroe's house and just sit down for a cocktail and have a nice conversation. He'd be there for a couple of minutes, and the next thing you know, he's guiding you down a hallway and shoving you in a dark room and putting headphones on you. So, and wanting to know what the effects were. So I really respect what he did in that regard. He combined this sort of intuition and creativity with a very straightforward and down-to-earth practical trial and error process.
In regard to their research, I decided to duck into their lab to observe how they control the experience for the explorer in the booth, and have a talk with the Monroe Institute's current principal investigator and president, Skip Atwater.
Thank you very much for joining me on The Trip for Life. Would you mind introducing yourself and what you do here at the Monroe Institute?
My name is Skip Atwater, and I'm now the president of the Monroe Institute. However, I've been around a number of years and had many different positions here at the Institute. Initially, back in 1977, a long time ago, I first met Bob Monroe and became involved in the Monroe Institute because I was working in the Army's remote viewing program, and we were looking for ways for our remote viewers to enhance their abilities, and so we came to the Monroe Institute at that time to develop training methodologies for that. Later, when I retired from the Army, Bob Monroe asked me to come down here and work at the Institute in the research section. So I spent about 20 years being involved in research here at the Monroe Institute. And then more recently, when Bob died and his daughter died, I became the president of the Monroe Institute in 2007 now. So it's been 4 years now since I've been the president of the Monroe Institute.
So what inspired you to continue working here at the Monroe Institute on these interesting questions after the death of Robert Monroe and his wife?
Well, I became enamored with how this technology works. It worked very well for me, and one of the reasons Bob brought me on board for research is I had this heartfelt desire to say, what in the world makes this stuff work? And also, as the years rolled by, I took on an attitude of this legacy that Bob had left behind and wanting to steward this changing of human consciousness forward. It's not like I'm an owner of a company or even the progenitor of the company, but I carry this stewardship, taking care of this company very seriously.
So when you're conducting experiments with a volunteer next door, what is it that you're doing in here to help facilitate that experience?
Well, I'm able to change up the audio stimulus they're receiving, plus I monitor physiological changes, knowing whether they are physically getting really relaxed, whether they are emotionally participating in what goes on, and choose questions which elicit information from them about their experience. It's much like having a lucid dream in which you are aware that you are having an experience. And so it's up to me to have them question what's going on with them and what meaning that has for them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I want to highlight that this is human experimentation we're talking about, and that has a very negative connotation. But we also need to bear in mind that it's also very common. What is wrong and ethically incorrect is experimenting on people against their will or without their consent. Right. Drug trials, for instance, thousands of them are happening across the United States every day. And the reason why they're legal and ethical is because people are consenting, or at least you're hoping that they're being somewhat informed of what they're consenting. It's not always the case. And the same thing was happening at the Monroe Institute. People weren't just like being randomly bombarded with binaural beats.
It's true. In fact, what began to happen was the experiences that people were having were so interesting and exciting that he really developed a cadre of people who were volunteering to explore these different states, and he even called them his explorers. And so they became pretty adept at the out-of-body experience, and also very adept at being able to report on the experiences that they were having. So it was very valuable information that was coming.
Going forward, what plans do you have for the Monroe Institute and for the HemiSync technology that you haven't already mentioned? In fact, one you did mention you might want to expand upon was the Division of Perceptual Studies. What is that all about?
The Division of Perceptual Studies is part of the University of Virginia. And this is an outgrowth of Ian Stevenson's work. Ian Stevenson was very interested in chronicling and researching stories of reincarnation. These would be often in third world cultures, and you'd have somebody who would remember their previous life. And oddly enough, very often they would show signs on their bodies of the way that they died. So, for instance, somebody who had been hit on the head sometimes would have a dent exactly where that club would have hit them.
And that was a very famous case, in fact, because they actually found their wife from the previous lifetime and interacted with them in a way that was at least proved to the two families that there was something real going on. That may actually be an aspect of Set, because that was from in a Hindu culture, and they'd already accepted that is possible. And so it was easier for them to sort of embrace the reality of what was happening.
And in fact, that was the reason why he did so much traveling across the world, because it was very difficult in a Western society to find anybody who even thought in those terms, let alone would report it. But in third world countries, he found it much easier to do that. Well, he created this research center, and then after his death, a number of his people who worked with him continued his own research, but expanded the work that he had done into looking at near-death studies, paranormal types of things. And so the Division of Perceptual Studies is about 25 miles from the Monroe Institute, and they're very interested in beginning to explore the effects of this technology from a physiological measurement aspect. So they've got state-of-the-art EEG equipment, but they've also got fMRI equipment that we can access. And for those folks who don't know, fMRI means functional magnetic resonance imaging, where you can actually track changes in the homeostasis of the brain.
It's actually much more sensitive than the EEG technologies that we had up to maybe even 6 or 7 years ago.
Right.
So it's a very great advancement.
And what they've got somebody within their group there that has actually found a way to integrate both fMRI with EEG.
Oh.
So that's a pretty big advancement. And so we're very excited about seeing where that might go in the future.
I look forward to reading the research that comes from that. It sounds fascinating. For those of you who are out there who may be Christians in the modern context, the idea of reincarnation might be a little offensive to you. But bear in mind that wasn't the case in the early church. In fact, there are remnants of that in the Bible. I want you to go into I think it's in Luke or maybe in John. It was while they were going up the mountain right before his transfiguration. And his disciples were asking him, well, everybody said that Elijah was going to come first before you did. So where's Elijah? And he said, he's already come and gone. And at that moment, his disciples recognized it was John the Baptist. Right. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if John the Baptist is the reincarnation of Elijah, then probably all the rest of us are less magnificent reincarnations of one sort or another.
If I may just expand on that, just a bit. What I think is even more fascinating than that is when Jesus goes up to the Mount of Transfiguration, he enters into a conversation with Moses and Elijah as if they are still alive at that point in time. And not only is he able to do that, but two of his disciples, or three of his disciples, I should say, witness this for themselves, and they're really blown away by it.
Yeah, the power of his perception was so great, it was actually leaking out to the people that were around him.
So, what is this a question of reincarnation? I'm not sure about that, but what I find really interesting is that it does call into question this dividing line between life and death. These guys had been dead for a long time, and yet they were still available for a conversation in the present moment. So that begins when you take into yourself this idea that maybe death is not what we think it is, then that changes your perspective as well, and maybe changes some of your fear of death too.
Join me next time when we'll wrap up with some of the intricacies of the HemiSync system and some information on how you can get involved with enhanced meditation and the Monroe Institute on the Trip for Life. Hello everyone. Over the past 10 months, I've traveled all over the United States in search of technologies and societal adaptations to help us cope with the changing world. I've also spent a lot of time editing and producing the best quality show that I could, within my means of course. I hope that the journey has been as fun for you to witness as it has been for me to experience. The things I've seen and documented give me hope that we can, indeed, pull through the challenges of a changing world. However, at the moment, I find myself not only on a trip for life, but also on a search for funding. My original plan was to fund the show with contributions and memberships to my website. That has not panned out. It may just be a symptom of the lousy economy, but only a few generous people have paid up to keep this show going. The Trip for Life is a full-time job, what with all the traveling and the extensive editing that goes into each episode. And even with all my frugal ways, my savings are running out. So I'm trying a new strategy. Kickstarter, a website dedicated to funding projects such as mine. Just go to Kickstarter.com and search for The Trip for Life. Once there, you can watch a quick video explaining what I'm doing, see what rewards I have on offer for contributions, and choose to be a backer, quickly and easily. Please back The Trip for Life so that I can continue on this journey to bring you the best of the future today.
The sky calls to us. If we do not destroy ourselves, we will one day venture to the stars.